The sound comes before the image. A diesel engine turning over in cold morning air, the slow, heavy churn of iron that has worked hard and knows it. Then the image cuts in. A county road at first light, gravel dust still hanging from the night before, a red tractor sitting alone at the edge of a field, like it has been waiting there for years. Because it has. This is Harlan County. Not a place that forgives bad decisions quickly. Not a place where a man can walk into the co-op on a Monday morning and pretend the weekend never happened. Everybody knows everybody, everybody watches everybody, and everybody remembers. The farm we are talking about sits on 800 acres of rolling ground that Earl Denton's grandfather broke with a two-bottom plow and a team of horses. His father added irrigation, Earl added scale. 3 generations of careful, stubborn, unspectacular work had built something real. Not flashy, not famous, but real. Paid for ground, clean equipment, a name in the county that meant something when harvest came around. The Massey Ferguson had been part of that story for a long time. Not because Earl was sentimental about color. Earl Denton was not a sentimental man. He was a man who read implement invoices the way other men read the Bible, carefully, repeatedly, and with the full weight of consequence in mind. The Massey Ferguson stayed on that farm because it worked, because the parts were available, because his mechanic knew it, because when you ran the numbers, real numbers, not dealer brochure numbers, it made sense every single year. That was before the new Case IH dealer opened up on Route 9. The building went up fast. Everybody noticed. Glass front, painted concrete floor visible from the parking lot, red and black signage that could be read from half a mile out on a clear day. They brought in a manager from out of state, a man named Trent Collier, who wore clean boots and talked about horsepower the way a revival preacher talks about salvation. Loud, confident, and aimed directly at the ego of every farmer within a 40-mile radius. Collier knew his market. He was not selling tractors. He was selling the idea of tractors, the idea of more, the idea that the machine you had was holding you back, that the ground you were farming deserved better iron, that a serious operation needed serious equipment, and that if you were still running what your father ran, maybe you were not as serious as you thought. It was a calculated pitch. And in a county full of men who had worked hard their entire lives and received very little public recognition for it, that pitch landed harder than Collier probably expected. Earl Denton heard it. Everybody heard it. The difference is that most men heard it, nodded, and went back to their farms. Earl Denton heard it and started thinking. That was the beginning of the problem. The specific tractor that started the conversation was a Case IH Magnum 340. Collier had one on the front lot, 340 horsepower, CVT transmission, full cab comfort package, guidance system pre-installed, the kind of machine that photographs well and commands attention at any field day within 100 miles. Earl drove past that lot 3 times in 2 weeks before he finally pulled in. Collier met him at the door. Of course he did. The walk around took 45 minutes. Collier knew his machine. He spoke fluently about torque curves and power management and precision agriculture integration. He had printouts. He had comparison charts. He had a laminated sheet that showed yield improvement projections based on horsepower increases. It was professional, it was thorough, and it was designed to make Earl feel like the Massey Ferguson sitting back at his farm was an embarrassment. Earl asked the right questions. What is the service interval on the CVT transmission? Collier had an answer. What is the parts lead time on the hydraulic stack if it goes down in August? Collier had an answer for that too. Not a fully honest one, but an answer. What is the realistic residual value on this unit at year 5 based on current used market conditions in this region? Collier smiled and said the market was strong. He said that with the confidence of a man who would not be there when the answer turned out to be wrong. Earl went home. He sat at his kitchen table for 2 evenings with a yellow legal pad and ran the numbers. Purchase price against trade value on his Massey Ferguson. Projected fuel consumption difference. Estimated maintenance cost differential based on what he knew from talking to other farmers who ran Case IH iron. Financing cost across a 7-year note at current rates. The numbers were not good. They were not disastrous, but they were not good. The Magnum 340 was going to cost him more to own than he had originally thought, more than Collier's numbers suggested, and Earl trusted his own numbers more than Collier's. He should have stopped there. He knew he should have stopped there. 30 years of farming had taught him to trust the yellow legal pad over the laminated brochure every single time. But he did not stop there. What changed the calculation, and this is the part that matters, the part that explains how a careful man makes a careless decision, was not the machine. It was the conversation at the elevator. It was a Thursday in late February. Earl was waiting on a price quote. There were 4 other men in the office. 2 of them were talking about the Case IH open house that Collier had scheduled for the following Saturday. One of them, Dale Pruitt, who farmed 600 acres north of town and had strong opinions about everything, said that the new Magnum was the only tractor a serious corn and soybean operation should be running in this county right now. He said it like it was a fact. He said it in front of everyone. Nobody disagreed with him. Nobody mentioned Massey Ferguson. Earl Denton heard that and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling. He felt like he was behind. He felt like the equipment he trusted, the equipment that had earned its place on his farm through years of reliable performance, was being dismissed without a fair hearing. And he felt, and this is the honest truth of it, embarrassed. That embarrassment is what drove him back to Collier's lot. Not the horsepower chart, not the guidance system, not the CVT transmission. The embarrassment of standing in the elevator office and feeling invisible while men talked about machines that were not his. He signed the paperwork on a Monday. The Massey Ferguson was hauled off on a Wednesday. Collier gave him what felt like a fair trade number in the moment, though Earl would understand later that Collier had known the wholesale market better than he let on. The Case IH Magnum 340 arrived on his farm on a Friday afternoon. It was a large, impressive machine. It filled his shed in a way that felt significant. His hired man, a quiet veteran named George, who had been on that farm for 11 years, walked around it twice and said nothing. George saying nothing was the same as George saying plenty. Earl told himself the numbers would work out. He told himself that the performance would justify the cost. He told himself that sometimes you had to move forward. He started spring work with a machine he did not fully understand yet. That is not an unusual situation. Every farmer learns new iron, but learning takes time, and time has a cost, and the cost of that learning was going to show up in places Earl had not fully anticipated. The first sign of trouble was minor, and Earl ignored it the way a man ignores the first small crack in a concrete wall. The hydraulic response on the Magnum was not what he expected coming from the Massey Ferguson. Not wrong, exactly, but different, and different in a way that required adjustment. An adjustment during planting season is not something you have time for. He lost a day and a half to calibration issues that his Massey Ferguson would never have caused him, because he knew that machine the way you know a tool that has been in your hand for years. George fixed it. George could fix most things. But George said, quietly, at the end of that week, that the parts they had needed for the calibration fix had taken 2 days to arrive, and that if something more significant went wrong in August, 2 days was going to feel like nothing. Earl filed that information and kept moving. The second sign of trouble was financial, and it arrived in September in the form of his first major service bill on the Magnum. The CVT transmission service cost more than Collier had projected. Not catastrophically more, but meaningfully more. Earl had budgeted based on Collier's numbers, which he should not have done, and the variance hurt him. He adjusted his operating budget, moved some money around, and told himself it was a 1-year anomaly. It was not a 1-year anomaly. Year 2 on the Case IH was harder. The growing season was difficult, dry in June, wet in August. The kind of year that punishes equipment because everything runs longer and harder than planned. The Magnum performed in the field. That is a fair and honest statement. The machine had power, and it used it. But the cost of running it through a hard season was higher than Earl had modeled. And the yield numbers, because the season was difficult for everyone, did not produce the margin that would have made those costs comfortable. Earl finished year 2 with a cash flow number that was tighter than anything he had seen in the previous decade. Not broke, Not in trouble with the bank, not yet, but tight in a way that felt different from the calculated tightness of a farm that is growing. This felt like a farm that was running to stay in place. He ran the numbers again that winter. Honestly, this time, without the optimism of a man who has just made a major purchase and wants to believe in it. The Massey Ferguson, had he kept it, would have cost him significantly less over those 2 years. Not because it was a more powerful machine, it was not, but because it was a known quantity on a farm built around its capabilities, because the parts were predictable, because the service intervals were manageable, because George understood it completely. The Case IH was eating margin that the farm could not spare. Earl did not tell anyone this. He went to the co-op. He talked about spring plans. He talked about input costs and crop insurance and the futures market. He did not mention that the machine sitting in his shed, the machine that Dale Pruitt had said a serious operation needed to be running, was costing him more than it was worth to his operation. In year 3, the transmission failed. Not a small failure. Not a calibration issue or a sensor fault that George could diagnose with an afternoon and the right scan tool. The CVT transmission on the Case IH Magnum 340 failed during the second week of corn planting on a Tuesday morning, at a moment when every acre per hour on that farm mattered completely. George called the dealer at 7 in the morning. The dealer called Case IH. The parts had to come from a regional distribution center 4 states away. The machine sat for 9 days. 9 days of planting season on 1,800 acres. 9 days during which the window was open and the soil conditions were right, and Earl Denton was watching the clock and watching the sky and watching his neighbor to the east, who still ran Massey Ferguson equipment and had not changed a thing about his operation, finish his planning and pull his equipment back into his shed while Earl's ground sat unworked. He rented a tractor to finish planting. The cost of the rental, the cost of the transmission repair, which was partially covered under warranty but not fully, and the agronomic cost of late planted acres added up to a number that Earl wrote down on his yellow legal pad and stared at for a long time. The number was not abstract. It was not a percentage or a projection. It was a dollar amount with a comma in it, attached to a decision he had made in a county elevator office because he had felt embarrassed by a comment from Dale Pruitt. Dale Pruitt, for what it is worth, had traded his own Case IH in by the following spring. The bank conversation happened in January of year 4. Earl's banker was a man named Phil Sorensen, who had been in agricultural lending in that county for 26 years. Phil was not a dramatic man. He did not lecture. He did not threaten. He sat across the desk from Earl Denton and laid out a series of numbers with the calm professionalism of someone who has had this conversation many times and believes in being direct. The farm was not in default. Earl had not missed a payment. But the operating line had been drawn on every year since the Case IH purchase, and the draw amounts had increased each year. And the farm's overall debt-to-asset picture had shifted in a direction that Phil described as something we need to watch carefully. Phil did not tell Earl what to do. That was not his role. But Phil said, and Earl heard this clearly, that the cost structure of the operation needed to change, and that some of that cost structure was equipment-related. Earl drove home from that meeting on a road he had driven 1,000 times. He passed the county fairgrounds where he had shown cattle as a boy. He passed the co-op where Dale Pruitt had made his comment about serious operations. He passed the Case IH dealership on Route 9 where Trent Collier still stood at the front lot in his clean boots, talking to someone new about the idea of more. He made a decision before he got home. He listed the Case IH Magnum 340 with the auction company in March. He did not use the dealer. He did not give Collier the opportunity to control the transaction. He put it in a major regional equipment auction scheduled for late April, the kind of auction that draws buyers from across 4 states, the kind where the crowd is experienced and the bidding is honest and the market tells the truth, regardless of what any dealer's laminated chart says. Word traveled fast, the way it always does in a county where everyone watches everyone. People knew Earl Denton was selling the Case IH. People knew why, even without being told, because the kind of man who trades a reliable Massey Ferguson for a flashy Magnum and puts it on the auction block 3 years later, has told his story without saying a word. The morning of the auction was cold and clear. Earl arrived early. He stood in the field of equipment. 300 machines lined up in numbered rows, everything from small utility tractors to articulated four-wheel drive machines worth more than most farms. And he found his Case IH in row 14 and stood next to it and looked at it the way a man looks at a decision he cannot take back. The auctioneer's crew had cleaned it up. It looked good. That much was true. It looked like a machine worth its price. The bidding started at a number Earl had hoped to see as a floor. It did not stay there. It moved upward at first, as the auction crowd took the measure of the machine, as buyers compared what they were seeing against what they knew about that model year and those hours and that transmission history. Someone in the crowd had done their homework. Word had gotten around, the way it always does among men who buy used iron professionally, that this particular Magnum had a transmission repair in its history. The bidding slowed. Then it stopped. The final number was $31,000 below what Earl had needed to clear his note. $31,000. That gap between what the machine was worth to the market and what it had cost him to own it represented in a single number the full consequence of the decision he had made 3 years earlier in a co-op office because he had felt small. He paid the difference out of his operating line. Phil Sorensen processed the transaction without comment. Earl Denton drove home from that auction past the Case IH dealership on Route 9. Trent Collier had been replaced by someone else. The front lot still had clean machines on it, and the signage still looked sharp. Nothing about that building acknowledged what had happened to one farmer's operation over 3 years of trying to afford it. Nothing ever does. The Massey Ferguson he bought to replace the Magnum was a used 8740S that came off a retiring farmer's operation 2 counties over. 1,100 hours, clean, serviced on schedule. George drove it back to the farm and called Earl from the road to say it ran like it had not worked a day in its life. That was not a compliment to the previous owner's light use. That was a compliment to the machine itself. Earl paid cash for it. He paid cash because he was done financing iron he could not justify, and because the auction had taught him something he already knew but had allowed himself to forget. The market does not care about what a machine looked like on a dealer's lot. It cares about what the machine costs to own, what it costs to repair, and what it will cost the next buyer to run. The market is honest in a way that dealer brochures are not, and auction day is when that honesty becomes public. George spent a full day going over the Massey Ferguson when it arrived. He went through every fluid, every filter, every grease point, every hydraulic line. He came in at the end of that day and told Earl the machine was solid. He said it with the tone of a man who had missed working on something he understood. Planting season that year was the first in 3 years that Earl Denton did not lose a day to equipment downtime. Not one day. The Massey Ferguson ran from the first acre to the last without incident, without a service call, without a parts order, without George standing in the shed with a scan tool and a worried expression. The fuel cost was higher per horsepower than the Magnum had been on paper. Earl had known that. He had built it into his numbers honestly, the way he had built everything into his numbers before Trent Collier had gotten involved in his thinking. The actual cost of running that farm that spring was lower than any spring since the Case IH purchase. Not because the Massey Ferguson was magic, but because downtime is expensive in ways that horsepower charts never capture. His neighbor to the east, the one who had never changed anything about his operation, the one who had still been running Massey Ferguson equipment while Earl was chasing the Magnum, came over in June to look at a fence line they shared. He did not say anything about the auction. He did not mention the Case IH. He looked at the Massey Ferguson sitting at the edge of the field and nodded once, the way men in that county acknowledge things without turning them into a conversation. That nod was worth more to Earl Denton than anything Trent Collier had ever said. The financial recovery took 2 full years. Not a dramatic comeback, not a story about a farm that bounced back and doubled its operation and proved everyone wrong in some visible and satisfying way. A real story. A slow and methodical correction of the course, made by a man who understood exactly where he had gone wrong and did not have the luxury of pretending otherwise. He cut his operating costs in year one of the recovery. He renegotiated his input contracts. He made 2 small equipment sales to reduce his debt load. He sat with Phil Sorensen twice that year instead of once, not because things were worse, but because Earl had decided that transparency with his banker was worth more than the pride of appearing fine when things were difficult. By the end of year 2, the operating line draw was half what it had been at the peak of the Case IH years. By the end of year 3, the farm's debt-to-asset ratio had returned to a place where Phil described it as healthy. He used that word specifically, healthy. Earl had not used credit to buy a tractor that he could not justify. He had not let a dealer's enthusiasm replace his own analysis. He had not made a decision based on what someone said in a county elevator office. He had run the numbers. The postscript to this story is not dramatic. Dramatic endings belong to a different kind of story, the kind where everything resolves cleanly and the lesson arrives with a clear moral and everyone goes home satisfied. Real farms do not work that way. Real farms are ongoing. They are the accumulation of hundreds of decisions made over decades, some of them right and some of them wrong, and most of them somewhere in between. And the measure of a farming operation is not any single decision, but the pattern across all of them. Earl Denton made a bad decision. He knew it was a bad decision while he was making it, or close enough to making it that the knowledge should have been enough to stop him. It was not. That is a human thing, not a farming thing. The gap between what you know and what you do, the space where embarrassment and ego and the opinions of men at the elevator office do the damage that hard seasons and bad prices could not quite manage. The Massey Ferguson 8740S is still on that farm. George maintains it on schedule. It has not missed a planting season, and it has not required a parts order that took more than a day to fill. It does what it was built to do, in the conditions it was built for, on a farm that can afford to run it. That is not a headline. That is not something you can put on a brochure or photograph for a dealer's front lot, or use to make a man at an elevator feel like he is falling behind. It is not designed to impress anyone. It is designed to work. 3 generations of Earl Denton's family built 1,800 acres of paid-for ground with equipment they could justify and decisions they could defend. The 4th generation, Earl's son, who came back to the farm after 2 years working in agricultural finance, and brought with him a sharper understanding of debt structure than Earl had possessed at the same age, looks at that Massey Ferguson in the shed and understands exactly what it represents. Not nostalgia, not sentiment, not a preference for red paint over red and black. Economics. Honest, unglamorous, yellow legal pad economics that does not care what Trent Collier thinks and does not feel smaller because Dale Pruitt has a strong opinion. The auction block told the truth. It always does. The only question is whether a man is willing to hear it before he consigns his machine to row 14 or after. Earl heard it after. The farm survived. The lesson did not come cheap. It never does.